on Zoom. I'll perhaps get the number. There's 27. I need to read, Shan. There's 27 people in the room, I think, and I'm not sure how many online. 27 online, 25 online, so it's 52. That's quite a good audience, but the Raptors always bring them in. Well, tonight we've got to talk about the South of Scotland Golden Eagle project. And I had a brief look actually at the bird atlas before I came this evening, and it definitely needs an eagle project in the south of Scotland. The north of Scotland was absolutely covered with observations of eagles, but down in the south there was very few, and very few also in Northern Ireland with a Golden Eagle project too, I understood. Well, tonight we've got the project's community outreach officer, who's Philip Munro over here. And those of you at home will see him in a minute. He initially did a countryside management course at Oakridge College, which is near Linlithgow, quite a well-known college. I can't read. Thank you. He then went on to Edinburgh University, where he did a course in sustainable environmental management. And after that, he became the estate manager at Abbotsford Estate, which was the home of Sir Walter Scott. I've never been, but it's very spectacular, I think, and quite a responsibility, I should think. He then moved to work with the Woodland Trust down in southern England before coming north again to the South of Scotland Golden Eagle project, where he's been working with them for the last 5 years. So I'm going to quickly turn over to him. I'm sure he's going to tell you the details of all that project. So we have to change microphones now, and I'll hand over to Philip.
Yeah. Thank you. Lovely. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me this evening. So yes, my name is Philip. I'm from the South of Scotland Golden Eagle project, and I work as one of the 2 community outreach officers. I'm going to speak for about 40-45 minutes. I'm going to start off with a brief background and quite a basic background to the Golden Eagle itself. I'm then going to go on to give a background to our project and then update you on. So I'll try and speak up a bit so you can hear me better. Yes, background to the project, and then an update over the work we've been doing over the last 5 years now that we've been working. And I'm going to start off with some vital statistics. I'll try again. Yeah, we green light. If you wouldn't mind, yes. First slide, please. Here we are, some vital statistics. So you can summarize this by saying it's a big bird. We all know that. A little bit smaller than a white-tailed eagle, and almost double the size of a buzzard, our most common raptor. Wingspan up to around 2.2 meters. It's the females that are the larger of the 2, male-female. There's a dimorphism in golden eagles, as there is with other raptors and other species. The breeding population at the moment is somewhere around 500 breeding pairs. I've got a slide later that we can break that down a little. And the average age of the golden eagle is about 23 years, although the oldest wild golden eagle is currently a Scottish bird that died at 33 years old up in Sutherland. So they can reach a decent age given the chance. But I always think it's interesting to touch on why we're so interested in raptors, and specifically the golden eagle. What are some of the characteristics that make them so special? If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So they're described as being the most elegant of all raptors, having majestic proportions and mastery of soaring or gliding flight, sometimes matched but never surpassed. They can reach phenomenal speeds, diving, stooping for their prey. There's various estimates online, but somewhere between 150, 200 miles per hour. And they're an incredibly agile bird for their size, given that they're our second largest raptor. Next slide, please. They also have phenomenal vision, said to be 8 times sharper than our vision. They can see their prey moving some 3-4 kilometers away. And they have a really wide field of vision as well, not just like us, we can only really take in what's directly in front of us, but much more to the sides as well. So we have speed and flight, we have their vision. Next slide, please. And we also have their strength. So I had wondered how they'd measured this, that a golden eagle has 10 times the grip strength of an adult human. But apparently it was a little piece of kit called a load cell that was put inside a tennis ball. And it was a falconry golden eagle that was trained to grip this and squeeze, and they could measure the strength of its grip. So it's no wonder we have such a fascination with these birds when you add up all these things, you know, the strength, the speed, the flight, the eyesight. And when we go into schools and we talk about the golden eagle, we always relate them to superheroes that children are really into, because it's these sorts of things that translate into the superheroes that they see on film and in TV and things like that. So no wonder we have such an interest in them. But thinking about, so their talons, that's obviously how they grip and dispatch their prey. If we could go to the next slide, we'll have a look at their diet. So this collage here represents a study that was carried out quite a long time ago. It was back in the 70s, 80s, and it was looking at the food that was brought back into the nest over the breeding season. So there's things you might expect to see there, corvids, small mammals, medium mammals, rabbits, hares, grouse, things like that. You've also got other raptors, buzzards, peregrine, kestrel, hen harrier there. You've got sort of larger mammals. You've also got things you might not expect, like the adder up in the top. So they have a really broad diet. They're not particularly fussy about what they eat. You'll also notice the lamb in the bottom left-hand corner. One thing to know about golden eagles is they're really shy, you know, despite their presence and their strength and, you know, how adapted they are to hunting. They're shy birds. They don't want to be in and around human contact or where we're present, where we're operating. So they stay well away from us. They're also not likely to take on a feisty ewe and risk injury. But they will take, and quite a lot of their food tends to be carrion. So things that have already died that are easy to take, they're not at any risk taking them. So they might well take a dead or dying lamb or a dead sheep on the hill, but it's very rare. We don't say it never happens, but very rare that they'd take on a live, healthy lamb. Next slide, please. So thinking a bit about their life cycle and starting with their nesting habits, they build their eyries quite often on these sort of really difficult to access high up ledges on mountainsides, and they can look quite scruffy like this one. They will sometimes build them in big old pine trees, and they can become these huge structures that are built up over years. They'll have more than one eyrie in a territory, sometimes 3, 4, 5 even, and they'll bring back new nesting material as early as November. They'll start to bring back fresh nesting material, build the eyries up, and they will swap between them between breeding seasons. Next slide, please. Usually 2 eggs, sometimes 1. On rare occasions, there might be 3 eggs. They'll lay between March and April. The female's on them for 90% of the time. She'll incubate for about 45 days. Next slide, please. The chicks usually hatch out in May. It takes them 1.5 days. They hatch with a fluffy down. They'll go on to develop a coarser down before the true feathers start to come through. And canism or siblicide is quite common up until 20 days old. So one chick killing the other chick. And that's quite relevant to us, as I'll come on to talk about a bit later. There's certain criteria we have to meet when we collect young eagles, chicks, and one of them being that they have to be from a twin nest. And it's when they're a bit older, between sort of 5 and 8 weeks old. So we have to find nests where both have survived. Next slide, please. So here we have chick at 2 weeks old. You can see there's little black tips of feathers starting to come through now. And it's crop, that expandable muscle at the top of the chest, where it can store its food and slowly digest. Nice and full here, so it's getting plenty of food. Next slide, please. So another 2 weeks later, about a month old, it's now adept at gripping and tearing its own food. A few more feathers coming through. Next slide, please. And then only 10 days later, it's a real rapid growth, development that they go through. So plenty more feathers, really growing in size and stature. Next slide, we've got them at 55 days old, so roughly the age that we'll take them. Very robust at this point. They can feed themselves from the food provided. They can keep themselves warm. You'll notice plenty of food being provided to this youngster here. Almost as big as the adult at this point. Next slide, please. So they'll fledge at roughly 11 weeks. At this point, they'll weigh between 3-4 kilograms. They'll be supported by the parents with food drops. So once they leave the nest, they're not on their own. The parents will be keeping an eye on them and still bringing food in. They can be independent from as young as 18 weeks. Quite often is longer than that. And sometimes the parents will drive them out if it's getting towards the next breeding season. Next slide, please. And finally, thinking about a bit about their sort of their life cycle. It's a real nomadic existence as a juvenile, as a sub-adult before they mature at around 4 or 5 years old. They're looking for food, primarily honing their hunting ability. They will molt every year, and their plumage changes. They lose the sort of white patches of an immature eagle, and they get a bit darker. But they're looking to secure a mate and find a territory, or a vacant territory, or find their own territory. There is a high mortality rate with young eagles, though, so quite a few don't make it to that 4 or 5 years old when they mature, whether that's perishing in the nest or through winter, not finding enough food. They are up against it. Next slide, please. So this is I find this such a great slide for showing the history of golden eagles in the south of Scotland and how that number has fluctuated. So this was part of a study that was published in 2012, looking at the history of golden eagles in Britain and Ireland. And it was a review using place names. And I've got a slide of these in a few slides time. And documentary evidence as well to look at where golden eagles and white-tailed eagles were. So map A at the top left there is the year 500. Map B at the top right is 1800. And map C at the bottom is 1920. So if we go all the way back in time to the year 500, these dark grey dots represent golden eagle territories. The pale grey are white-tailed eagle, and the black is where they overlap or share the airspace. So if we're looking at the south of Scotland, you can see golden eagles right across the south of Scotland, into the north of England, down into the Midlands, Wales, and even in the southwest of England there, and all around Ireland, Northern Ireland. It's quite a jump, but we get to the year 1800 and we can see golden eagles and white-tailed eagles have disappeared from England and Wales, and far fewer in the south of Scotland. And by 1920, we know that white-tailed eagles had become extinct from Britain and Ireland, Northern Ireland at that point, and golden eagles too disappeared from England, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the south of Scotland. And at that point, it was primarily persecution of birds of prey, of golden eagles. If we go to the next slide, so these are the place names, and I apologize how tiny these labels are, so you might not be able to see them. This is taken from a piece of interpretation in a golden eagle exhibition, which I'll mention later on. And it uses the Old English term for eagle, ern or yern. And you can see some of the names there, like Ern Clwch, or it translates to Eagle Gully, Ern Crag, Eagle Cliff, and several others there, taking inspiration from the landscape and an obvious association with golden eagles in those areas. So we can be quite confident of the golden eagle's presence across the south of Scotland. If I can go to the next slide. And this is up to date. So this is a map from the RSPB showing the spread of golden eagles in Britain and Ireland. And it's a useful map because we see there the golden eagles in the south of Scotland. It's important to say how vulnerable and small and isolated that population is, or certainly was before we started our work. You'll notice golden eagles back in Ireland and Northern Ireland. So that was the result of a reintroduction that started back in 2000 over a few years. Our project is a reinforcement. So we have golden eagles in the south of Scotland, and we're looking to reinforce that number through a series of translocations. Next slide, please. I think it does stick. It might be just that there's a few logos on the next slide. I think here we are. Thank you. So just to point out that it's a partnership. It's not just us, the South of Scotland Golden Eagle Project. It is Scottish Land and Estates, Scottish Forestry, Nature Scot, RSPB, and our host partner, Southern Uplands Partnership, and of course our funders too. Next slide, please. And sorry, this is a bit dry. We don't ever like to just read text on a slide, but I think it's just important to point out that our project goes all the way back really to 2008 when surveys really established the situation in the south of Scotland, and numbers were critically low. And a series of studies being carried out into golden eagles in the south of Scotland, and more specific studies into food availability and these sorts of things, which are available on our website. But all that information being fed through to the National Species Reintroduction Forum, and the suggestion being that a translocation, a reinforcement was the way to go ahead. And it wasn't until June 2018 that we had our first eagles released. So 10 years of studies and of public consultations and fundraising, all these things that need to happen before a project like this gets started. Next slide, please. And also just to point out that this study, this overview into golden eagles in the south of Scotland, established that the habitat availability, the food availability, these sorts of things could support between 14 and 16 breeding pairs. I've been asked a few times, how many golden eagles are you going to be putting out there? But it's a very considered number to support a population in the south of Scotland. We're not bussing them down and throwing them out there. It's a few. But I'll come on to be a bit more specific about that in a few slides' time. Next slide, please. But some of the challenges that this report identified, I think it's interesting to note. So obviously land use, which has changed considerably over the years, and it's primarily disturbance and displacement in the landscape. So where there's potential eagle habitat that could be taken over and a territory could be established, if there's forestry, if there's wind farms or other structures in these areas, it could put off golden eagles from becoming established in these areas. So when people talk about wind farms, they often talk about strikes, which I know is relative to some birds, not particularly the golden eagle. There's been a very few recorded strikes from wind turbines on golden eagle. They seem to be able to avoid them, but therein is the problem that they probably wouldn't inhabit these areas. Similar with forestry, it's just not the kind of habitat that they thrive in. And yet other structures in the landscape too. Next slide, please. A similar problem with recreation, although this is an interesting slide out in the Outer Hebrides, and there's 2-3 houses, cottages in that image that are inhabited all year round. But there is an eagle's eyrie nest on those crags there, which is very productive. So perhaps where there hasn't been a sustained history of disturbance, persecution maybe, that there is a small level of tolerance there that they can live close to human activity. And sorry, can I go back a slide for a second? No, don't worry. It's just to point out that whilst talking about these things like renewable energy and forestry, really important for the economy and sustainability, and tourism's hugely important to Scotland as well. So it's not by any means saying that these things shouldn't happen. It's just finding a balance. Next slide, please. And persecution, which is quite often grabs the headlines, and rightly so. There's no acceptable level of persecution, and it does still happen. Our project is doing a lot to try and build bridges between conservation and land management. So we employ a stakeholder engagement officer who's full-time and his job is to go out there and to speak to people working on the land, be it farmers, keepers, estate managers, landowners, tell them about the project and engage with them, take on board concerns and feed that back to our board and scientific advisory panel and get a dialogue going there, provide advice, information, which is an important approach to these sorts of things. Next slide, please. The report also identified climate change as having an impact. So the two maps on the slide there show average rainfall, April, May, June between the top 1981 and 1985, and at the bottom 2001 to 2006. And you can just see how much wetter it is, particularly up in the upland areas. So a wetter climate will have an impact on the food available for the golden eagle. So the breeding condition and productivity of prey is not going to be as great in wet climate, and that has an impact further up the food chain for the golden eagle. Next slide, please. Prey availability was mentioned, and certainly there are areas of the south of Scotland where there isn't much prey around, and that's been taken into account in these studies and the number of eagles we release. But this is a fantastic image from Tony Lightly, one of the raptor study group workers in the south of Scotland, showing a nest in the south, and this chick here having a huge, abundant amount of prey available to it. So rabbit, hare, there was portions of grey squirrel and of red squirrel, but yeah, plenty of food available to it. Next slide, please. And the final challenge that the study talks about is recruitment. And this isn't the best slide really to show this. So these are tag birds, one in the south of Scotland and several up north. And it just shows no movement of birds to the south of Scotland. But we know that there are eagles over on Arran and in Argyll that could perhaps come over here, but there's just a lack of data to show that. But we know that it's a stagnant situation in the south. There's not that movement of eagles to boost the population here. So we need a project such as ours to boost the population, and then you might get eagles coming over and finding potential mates and staying in the south of Scotland. So yeah, we'll move on to the next slide now. So with all that behind us, you know, all the planning, the preparation, the studies, all these sorts of things, we finally got going in early 2018. And the first thing we had to do was build our aviaries. They're up in the Moffat Hills. We're no more specific than that for obvious reasons, but they're in that area. And this is what they look like. And there's a bank of 4, and then there's always a separate aviary on its own, a sort of quarantine aviary should we ever need that. Next slide, please. This is what they look like inside. So there's a nesting tray. There's the feeding hatch at the back, which has a hood over it. This was just as they'd been built. So the eagles don't see us apart from when we collect them and when we fit the satellite tags. All the feeding, all the monitoring of them inside the aviaries is done through tiny little spy holes in the back and in a little chamber that looks into the aviary here. And there's various perches for them as well. Next slide, please. So this is the core of our work, the translocations, which happen each summer across a 5-year project period. The license we have from Nature Scot allows us to collect up to 10 each year. We can only collect them, as I mentioned at the beginning, between sort of 6 and 8 weeks old. And there's some areas that we can't collect from, some special protection areas where they don't want the number of eagles impacted. So there's some areas we can't collect from, and we can only collect from twin eyries. So there's various criteria there that we have to take notice of, and that soon whittles down the number of potential eagles. So it's not that easy. And once we collect them, we keep them in our aviaries for approximately 6 weeks before we release them. They are fitted with a satellite tag just before they're released. And then obviously we monitor that data thereafter. And all this work is hugely supported by a number of people and organizations, specifically the raptor study groups, who can tell us where these birds are, where there's twins, and the landowners, the estates, who can help us with access and information as well. You can see in the image here, the team, it's kept as small as possible. So you've got a vet's assistant, you've got John, our eagle officer, with the basket on his back, and there's also a climber there as well to help access nests, which often involves rigging up equipment and abseiling down to them. Next slide, please. And so this is what it looks like when we go into an area. This is one we collected from in 2019. The chicks tend to be quite docile, just hunker down. There's not any dramatic movement or anything like that. The parents keep an eye on us from a distance. We know from all the areas we collected from that the remaining chick goes on to fledge without any problem. So undoubtedly there's going to be a bit of stress there, but we're as quick as possible. Both chicks are assessed by the vets. We take one with us, and then it's straight back down to our aviaries. If we go to the next slide, we can see the vet Neil from the Dick Vet in Edinburgh making assessments of the birds. So various checks of their breathing, their hearts. He'll check their talons, their beak, their eyes, all these sorts of things. Blood samples will be taken. Can check for known diseases. Also, it's the best way to sex the birds, if it's male or female. Various measurements are taken for ongoing studies. And at this point, the bird will also have a metal ring tag fitted to its leg. Next slide, please. And it goes into a specially constructed travel box on a nice, comfortable memory foam mattress strapped into the vehicle. The vehicle's ventilated, and then it's straight back down to our aviaries. And you can just see that in this next slide. That's John and Neil delivering one of the first birds in 2018. Next slide, please. So in 2018, as I was saying earlier on, it can be a tricky business finding eagles under the right circumstances. So we only collected 3 in 2018, 2 females and a male. Depending on who you speak to, whether it's on the sort of sciencey side of the project or on the people side of the project on my side, they'll call them by their ring tag number, so C09, C11. I'll call them Edward and Beaky. So that's the names given to them by primary schools that we work with. You get some funny names. If we go to our next slide, we have Emily, which I thought was quite a good name. That was the 3rd bird collected, the 2nd female in 2018. In 2019, again, a tricky year. Again, only 3 birds, 3 males this time. And it was all went to plan with the collection of the birds and the translocation, their time in the aviaries, their release. They found the feeding stations that we put out after their release. But then we noticed some data that suggested everything wasn't quite right. Unfortunately, one of the females, Beaky from 2018, had returned to site. She'd been a few miles away. You could see from her data that she'd made a direct journey back to this release valley. And unfortunately, she killed 2 of these males. So John was able to observe her act in a quite a dominant behavior. What we think happened was that they're not, at this age, they're not territorial, they're not on territory, they're not defending a territory. But what we think might have happened is that she returned to the release valley, noticing some activity, noticing some other birds, and found the feeding stations full of food and wanted to defend that food for themselves. So we're able to locate one of the males and have a post-mortem carried out, and the injuries, as we suspected, suggested that it had been attacked by this bird. We weren't able to find the 2nd male. We think that his satellite tag had been damaged in an attack by this female from 2018. So very unfortunate that the 3rd male, having been kept off the feeding stations, was quite weak. And although the wild birds, and once we release them, they're out there in the wild, his best chance was just to be recollected and released from another area, which is what we did. And the upshot of this was we've since released in different areas a few miles away. But a very unusual set of circumstances there, not something that all the people that we work with could have planned for or thought might happen. So we move on from that with that knowledge, and it's informed some of the practice since. But if we go to the next slide, we can see the 3rd male from 2019 named Scan by one of our volunteers, Charlotte Martin, being a translation, a Native American translation to Spirit of the Sky. So we go to our next slide, please. Just a comment on, before I go on to the subsequent years, comment on the names, which some people are in favor of and some people aren't in favor of. It really helps us to engage with people, particularly young people and communities. So just and there's often a story behind the names as well. So Sinclair F03, he was released in 2021, was named by Moffat Mountain Rescue Group, who we work with in various capacities. Their founder was Dr. Hugh Sinclair back in the 60s. So they named the bird Sinclair. Emma at the bottom left there was named in memory of Emma Rich, who was a women's rights campaigner named by the Green MSP, whose name has just gone straight at my head. But and then we have Speckled Jim, who was named by the project because of his unusual speckled plumage. And this went over my head at first because perhaps not my generation, but Speckled Jim was apparently the pigeon from Blackadder, if anyone was watched Blackadder. But funny enough, we had to get permission from Richard Curtis himself, who was emailed by our press officer and who granted us permission to use the name Speckled Jim. So anyway, there's often a story behind these names. Next slide, please. And if you press again, this video should run. So in 2020, we couldn't carry out any field work because of the pandemic. So there was no birds collected in 2020. But 2021 was a different story, and we had 8 golden eagles successfully released, and a nice balance. There was 4 females and 4 males. So you're about to see one of those birds go. That's actually probably one of the more dramatic releases. They tend to jump out onto the floor in front and just have a wander about, but you can see the next bird lining up there. Next slide, please. I think that's just a repeat. Here we are, and this is a video as well, if you wouldn't mind playing that. And then just last year, again, a decent number, 6 birds, 3 males and 3 males, so a lovely split again. And you can see here some of the behavior just after the release, playing with a bit of grass or moss there, which is lovely to see. Just doing the same again. So that's us up to date with our translocations, summer translocations. Sub-adult translocations is something a bit new that's been happening over the last couple of years. So this is a experimental license granted to us by NatureScot to trap and release birds that are roughly between sort of 6 months old and 3 years old. So they've already fledged, and we work with very experienced licensed individuals who will trap those birds and bring them back down for release. You can go to the next slide, please. So this work happens on the Outer Hebrides, where there's a very high concentration of young eagles. The traps are operated manually with the operator in sight of the bait. The bird comes down to the bait, and then a net is sprung over the top of the bird, trapping the bird. The operator is then able to instantly go and assess the bird. So they assess their plumage to get an idea of their age. And if they're in the right age range, they're then collected, assessed by the vet, and brought back down to the south of Scotland, where they're kept in our aviaries. If we go to the next slide. So it's a bit different. This is a video, so should run another tap. A bit different from our translocation of the younger birds. So they're kept in the aviaries overnight and then released the next day. So we don't really hang about. This work was sort of in response to the low number of birds that were collected in the first few years. And obviously we're going to learn a lot from the data from these birds, whether this method of translocation, of translocating older birds, is viable for future projects such as ours. This work hasn't really been done before, translocating golden eagles of that age, so it's something we'll learn from. I've now got a few videos from their activity, their behavior inside the aviaries, which is monitored quite closely by John. So you can see here, these are 2 birds from 2018 preening each other, and it's all quite amicable in the aviaries. You know, it's interesting that they come from twin nests. Whether they consider this other bird a twin or not, we don't know, but it's quite affectionate behavior. There's the odd little squabble over space on the nesting tray or when food drops in, but it's never overly aggressive. And you've got Edward at the back here, displaying the type of behavior we'd expect to see in the wild. So just playing with the prey, practicing his hunting skills and getting his balance. So exactly the sort of thing we want to see. And the next one is a video of Emily with some food. So we've tried to provide a range of food to them in the aviaries and on the feeding stations once they're released. Portions of rabbit, hare, fox, deer, grey squirrels. Often we get donated to us by control programs. So just keying them into the different things that they'll find in the wild. And then here we have Edward, not long before release. He's not got his satellite tag on yet, but so they'll start coming off the nesting tray, as they will do in the wild as well. They won't just launch from the nest one day. They'll start to scramble about and start exercising their wings. And if we can go to the next slide. So the satellite tags, again, fitted by licensed and experienced handlers, are fitted when the birds are fully grown, so it won't impact on the bird's movement or its flight. And this work obviously allows us to monitor the birds after they're released, where they're going. The tags could last the lifespan of the bird. So there is a bird at the moment in the south of Scotland that was tagged some 10, 11 years ago, and that is still providing data. So with these lithium-ion batteries, they could go on for a wee while. So we can understand how that bird's faring. What it also allows us to do is then go and engage with people in those areas. So our stakeholder engagement officer can go out and speak to people on the land and tell them about the project, tell them that there's a bird in the area, and get a bit of dialogue going. So it's really important in both respects there. Next slide, please. And then just start this video. So this was our very first release back in 2018. Whilst the birds were having their satellite tags fitted, the BBC came and fitted a remote camera at the front of the aviaries, I think expecting that it'd be really dramatic, that the hatch would come down and the bird would launch itself out and off into the distance. But, you know, as we were saying at the beginning, really shy, cautious birds taking in their surroundings and yeah, not quite what was expected. And also the camera was only programmed to capture, I think it was 30 seconds, then it would stop, and then it would be reactivated. But within that little gap, that was when Edward took his chance and went off. But the next video is taken by John up in the hills with a good scope on him. So you can see the camera there, and you'll see Edward just come out over the top of it. Nice, a little bit shaky, but you can see there, not proficient flyers at this point, still building up those flight muscles. So a bit of a flap and a glide and down into the bracken, but he was fine. And interestingly, from there up onto the wall and then up onto the top of the aviaries where the C09 Beaky, who he'd shared an aviary with, or sorry, C11, was still inside, and he stayed there for a bit of time. So obviously had formed a bit of a bond with her. If we go to our next slide and play this video. So these are the feeding stations that I have mentioned, and this is a really important part of the process. As I said earlier on, once they fledge in the wild, the parents will still provide them with food. So this is us mimicking that, providing food that's easily located close to the aviaries. And the birds quickly find that, and it's readily available, and they can come to there and find food. We often get asked, you know, you're providing this food to them, do they have any need to go anywhere else? But they do have an innate desire to explore, to move around, to find fresh prey, to hunt. So we see them leaving within a couple of months sometimes of the release area. And this is a video, I don't know if I mentioned this at the start, a fantastic comparison between golden eagle and buzzards, which they often get mistaken for. But you can see here just the difference in size. And it's a lovely bit of video for showing those big white patches of a subadult eagle. So since the release and over the subsequent years, we've seen the birds moving over right across the south of Scotland. We've had birds going down into the north of England as far as the North Pennines and coming back again, and sort of regular incursions over the border. What are they doing? They're exploring, as I was saying earlier on. They're looking for prey. They're honing their hunting ability. They're coming into contact with each other. So we have two birds, Beaky and Scan, from 2019. And this sort of behavior here, the talon locking, the undulating flight, the touching wing tips, is often associated with breeding. They were a little bit young here. This was a few years ago, but since then they have seemed to establish a pair, and they did build a nest. They don't tend to be successful, or they certainly didn't lay eggs last year, but we'll be watching that carefully this year to see if they're successful. If we go on to the next slide. I don't really do it justice, but just 2 or 3 slides on the public engagement side of the project, which really goes hand in hand with the conservation work. So we have all sorts of programs to engage people, whether that's young people in schools or in youth clubs, or volunteers out and about, or helping us with events and talks, or that, all these sorts of things. I think in the south of Scotland, people are a bit disengaged, perhaps, with what apex predators are out there, and we often think golden eagles, they're just up in the Highlands, but they've always been in the south of Scotland, really, and we're trying to sort of inspire people again, and a sense of or an understanding of that they're in their native habitat here. If we go to the next slide, there's other ways we can do this as well, and looking at how we might benefit the economy through our work. So you only have to look at other raptor projects to see how beneficial they are, and bringing in visitors and bringing in money, and then every survey that's done of your favorite species in this favorite animal in Scotland or whatever, golden eagle usually comes out top. So it's not difficult to inspire people, but it's interesting the way we do that doesn't lead to any sort of negative disturbance of these birds, but it's done in a positive way. So one of the ways we've done that, if we go to the next slide, is we have an exhibition which is with a small estate in the Scottish borders, Philip Hoch, just outside Selkirk. They gave us the use of this room and some funding to put together an exhibition, small but mighty. There's plenty of information and things on display and videos of the birds. There's games for children and that sort of thing. So if you're down in that area, it's well worth a visit. We also have, which is shown on the next slide, our Eagle Festival, which has run in Moffat for the last 2 years, was supposed to start in 2020, but postponed due to the pandemic. And that'll be happening again this year, and hopefully then taken on by the community and run every year. So lots of different activities, talks, eco fairs, and activities for children, and all sorts of things going on over 2 or 3 days. And finally, I like to end on this quote: "Humankind needs golden eagles, or you would not think it from the way we have persecuted them. We need them to marvel at the spread of their wings, the soaring icons of wildness that make our hills and glens so special. We need them to teach respect for wildness to our children. We need them to restore our bruised spirits when life gets tough. And above all, we need them to remind us that we are part of nature, not apart from it," which is a lovely quote from Sir John Lister Kay. So thank you very much. If there's any questions, I'd love to try and answer them. If I don't know, I will know someone who will. Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Well, we've had trouble with the microphone, as we are here actually in previous weeks, and the people at home couldn't hear some of the questions. So we're going to try and ask the speaker to select people in the audience, and he can have the microphone and take it to the person, and hopefully everybody will be able to hear it. So let's try that.
Lovely. Right at the back.
Right. You only collected 3 birds in the first 2 years. Was that because you couldn't find suitable twin sites?
Yes. So yeah, it was down to the number of birds available.
Come back and address the whole audience.
Yes. Sorry.
Could you repeat the question?
Sorry. The question was why we only collected 3 birds in 2018. What that came down to, and it is literally the twins that are available to us. Finding twins at the right time, at the right age, in the right areas. So some areas, some special conservation areas where we can't collect from because they don't want to impact the number of birds. We can't collect from those. We don't have a license that covers those areas. And yes, in some years they just aren't productive. You know, they might not have twins. They might only have one, or only one survives to that point between 5 or 6 and 8 weeks when we can collect them. So we're a little bit at mercy to all these things coming together to, you know, allowing us to make a collection. And we look to have the agreement of the raptor study groups and the estate on side, and that all comes down to us trying to develop relationships and you know, build a dialogue between, you know, everyone that's involved in a project like this. Sorry, does that yeah, of course, I'll repeat it. Yeah, go for it. Yeah. Oh yeah, good, fair question. Yeah. So the vet will make an assessment of the birds, and perhaps the one that looks to be a bit more robust, maybe a wee bit bigger, we'd probably go for that bird. Subsequently, if we had a bit of an imbalance of male and females, they might make an informed guess to which one was which through various measurements of the feet and things like that. If it looks like the remaining bird might not survive, we wouldn't collect from that nest. We only collect when we can be confident that the bird that we're not collecting will go on to fledge. So the vet will have a good look at both of them. But yeah, that's the sort of decisions they're making. Thank you. Any other?
Can I ask a question? I think I can. I was wondering how long the project will run for and what the future of it is.
So we're in our final year now. The question was how long the project will run for and what the future is. So we're in our final year of funding. We had an additional year of funding granted to us because of the time lost and obviously no collections carried out during the pandemic, which was a tricky year for everyone. So our funding runs out at the end of this year, but there are discussions going on to what might follow that. Certainly the data that is provided from the satellite tags, that will continue to be monitored, whether that is funded through an employee or whether it's raptor study groups or another organization. You know, that's precious data, and it's important that we continue to monitor that and understand that. Whether there'll be further translocations, that's currently being decided. Whether there's this sort of appetite for further public or community outreach, again, not quite sure. So we're certainly around for the next year, and we'll see after that. Lovely. There's another question there. I'll just repeat it. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're primarily in upland habitats, and you're right. Yes, more open habitat where they can find prey and drive them and hunt them. In terms of grouse moors, I mean, we work very closely with estates to try and, as I was saying early on, sort of build a dialogue and provide information and you know, get them on board with the work we're doing. And I have to say, we've only really had positive engagement. I think it helps that our stakeholder officer is a retired keeper. He's previously worked on a similar, well, it wasn't a translocation project, but it was a project aimed at boosting eagle numbers out on Kintyre. And so he has that history and has a good network, and obviously speaks the language and can go in and take on board their concerns and communicate that, and we can get a bit of back and forth going. So I think it's obviously it's not the only solution to persecution going forward, but I think it's an important part of you know, improving that situation. Sorry, does that answer your question? Is that sort of a yeah. Yeah, and there's certainly competing interests, you know, when you factor everything in, you know, wind farms and forestry and rewilding and you know, tourism or you know, these sorts of things. So it's an important balance to strike. But I think the work of you know, projects, and I'm referring to the Borders, where I know of the work that the Borders Forest Trust are doing, and at Langham Moor as well. It's a mosaic of habitats that they're trying to create, and not just sort of blanket woodland, you know, more scrubby areas and open areas, which a lot of different species prefer. So I would hope that you know, a wide gamut of you know, biodiversity is being considered during these projects. Yeah. But a lot of work to be done. You know, habitat protection foremost and creation is a real key part of, you know, goes hand in hand with the work we're doing as well. Yes.
Apologies if this early, but would you like to say something about how far these birds have already travelled, or is it too early?
Yeah. So the question was how far have they traveled? How far do we think they might travel? It's interesting. The birds released, the young birds that we collect from the nests have primarily stayed in the south of Scotland. They are all in the south of Scotland, small trips into the north of England and back again. They're certainly not heading back to where they were collected from. They are getting to it. The birds released 2018, 2019 are getting to that age now where we're starting to see the data suggesting that they're on territory in the south of Scotland. So I think there's 3 territories that look like have been established. And over the next 2-3 years, we might see or the next year or two, we might start to see attempts at breeding eggs, chicks. The birds, the sub-adults that have been translocated, 2 or 3 of them have been making larger journeys up north, but we don't know if will come back. Some have come back and then gone again. And as I said, it's an experimental license, so we will learn a lot from that, and whether it's a viable form of conservation work to boost numbers in this sort of way. So the younger birds haven't done that. The older birds were collected on the Outer Hebrides. We haven't seen them go back out there. I mean, you've got quite a large body of water, which you don't tend to see golden eagles cross. So they haven't gone back to the Outer Hebrides, but they have gone up north to other areas. So perhaps, you know, being that bit older when they were collected, you know, they're not. It's interesting. The young chicks that we bring down, they stay in the aviaries for a lot longer, and they see the landscape in front of them, which perhaps then develops, you know, a bit of a connection between these areas, and they don't go as far, but not quite sure. But this is something that will be studied long term, you know, the data that's provided, and we can find out a bit more about their behavior after a project such as ours. Thank you.
Do you have any sense of mortality rates and reduction?
Overall, out with our project, I have read studies that have suggested mortality rates quite high, you know, up around the sort of 70% of young birds. I wouldn't be able to back that up with much knowledge, I'm afraid. It's a very interesting question, and one I can perhaps. Oh, so this is translocated birds. Right, okay. Not sort of solid data that I could provide you with. I do know that, you know, the Irish project, which was similarly collecting young birds like we do, and then releasing them in a different area, they've gone on to breed, and there is a breeding population of eagles back in Ireland, Northern Ireland now. So, but I couldn't comment on a comparison with birds that haven't had any sort of, you know, interaction with us. But it's an interesting question. I'll feed that back, and yeah, if I get anything, I'll forward it on.
Well, people draw a line under the question. So I'm hoping you're going to stay for tea. Tea. And
yeah, I'll mill around. Yes. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Really interesting talk, and all those people who took the films. I think it takes such a lot of patience to get really good wildlife pictures, and I always feel the photographers get left left out.
Yes.
So, great. So I'll take this over.
Yep.
Now, I hope everybody at home on Zoom could hear us this time. And I'm just going to turn over and talk about, I try every time that I'm sharing to talk about some of the projects that we do to conserve wildlife around us here in Stirling. And I'm going to talk, if I can get it coming, about the work of the planning group. The planning group is, or the planning team, I think they're called, are the perhaps the most important group that we have. And they try to look at all the planning applications, which these days not only have a lot of building planning applications, that sort of thing, but also a lot of forestry applications. So they're always looking for new talent. But this is just one project which I was told about where we had some impact on a planning application just recently. Now, this is a planning application, it's an application for what's called a WIAT, W-I-A-T, up at the top there. That's a woodlands in and around towns project, and they get a grant, and the idea is, the purpose of a WIAT grant is to improve accessibility and management of urban woodlands to encourage their use by local people. And I think it's the shown relationship between well-being, a feeling of well-being in people who go out into the countryside, which has got the government to issue these grants. So this grant is for, can I move off of this camera? Okay, this grant is for a site will be familiar to anybody in Dunblane, which is up the top there, and Bridge of Allen down the bottom there, at Drumdrools. It's an old farm between the River Allen and the old road which used to connect Bridge of Allen to Dunblane, but is now just a cycle track. So here is the River Allen going along here, and it's this big area here of woodland which has applied for that grant. And our planning group will have looked at this planning application, and the projects in it are to improve the management of this woodland generally, and that means that they're going to remove particularly dangerous trees with ash dieback, of which there are hundreds, to remove non-native conifers, which there aren't many actually in those woodlands, and to replant them with native broadleaves, and to remove the invasive rhododendrons. So that's one project. Now also they want to improve biodiversity, and the thing that struck me was the project to introduce more pine marten dens. I'm not sure quite how you do that, but it would be nice to have more pine martens there. They're also going to improve public access through this area. So the famous Darn Walk, which goes along the River Allen and was so famous of Robert Louis Stevenson actually, that is going to be improved, and it certainly needs it. And there's another track which goes from the river up to the cycle path, which is usually running with water. They're going to improve that too. And the other project is to improve public awareness of the area and get more people to visit it. Now, I think we find all those objectives laudable, but there were one or two points which we asked them to change. Can we have the next slide? Right, so this is actually the application, and all those green squares are projects on their land. You see there's some red ones up the top there where or some of them, we got changed. And one, just to give you an illustration of what the planning group do, they wrote and pointed out, can we have the next slide, that along the cycle track, the planning application said they wanted to improve all the gullies down the roadsides on the cycle track. Well, we've had that done before, and it had a disastrous effect on the orchids which grow on them. So I actually took this picture with some undergraduates at Stirling, showing how close these orchids are. And these are rare birds' nest orchids. They don't have any chlorophyll in them, so they're very interesting to biologists. But you can see how near to the edge of the road they are, and the gully that they would clear to is right back at the right-hand side of this picture. So we pointed this out to them. Now, actually, when it was done before, they cleared the gutters out before, they actually exterminated another type of orchid, the next one. This is the broad-leaved helleborine. Here it is. And our group got seeds to try and regrow it. And in this last year, we just succeeded in getting a few plants to regrow along that strip, only to find that they wanted to clear it all out again. Anyway, we pointed this out to them with a lot of other tiny points, really, of what we would like to see, and they agreed to all of them. So that's why the label was in red. They're not going to proceed with that, and hopefully the orchids can flourish as a result of it. So we owe a great debt of thanks to particularly Liz Albert and her team that do all this work. It may be very boring for me to have to do, I have to say, so I admire all the work that they do. Now we have a few notices too, so can you put the next slide on? The next talk is by John Haddow. He's in the audience here today, and he's going to talk about bats and trees, and I look forward to that. So that's on Tuesday the 7th of March, the usual time in here. Are we going to run it online? Yes, we're going to run it so that you can watch it on Zoom. Okay, the next slide is a talk at the calendar group. That's before that one, actually. This is on Thursday, the 16th of February. That's next week. And it's going to be the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland's role in international conservation. But they do a lot of conservation work in Scotland, of course. So it'll be a mixture of home and abroad, I think. And that's at St Andrews Hall, Lenny Road, Calendar. Next slide. All right. I was asked to advertise the Tree Link Stirling. Please join us for Tree Link Stirling first spring gathering. It's going to be in the Guide Hall in Glebe Avenue, Stirling, and they want anybody who's interested in trees to go along, and they'll talk about what they do and try and get you involved in that. So that's on the 4th of March at 10 to 12 noon. I think that's the last slide. That's the last slide. So thank you. Oh, before I go, Jan, you wanted me to remind people that we desperately need new people for the committee. It is getting desperate. And I must thank Chris, who none of you at home can see, but he's the guy who's been working the IT with Guy at the back of the hall there. Thank them both for doing that, and particularly Chris, who supplies all the equipment too. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and don't go home before you get tea.